What happens when the most powerful woman in Manhattan loses everything in a single night and collapses into the arms of a man who has nothing left to lose, one ruthless billionaire, one broken single dad, and a single desperate whisper in the rain that changed both their lives forever. Eleanor Hastings was untouchable. At 34, she was the sole founder and CEO of Vanguard Nexus, a multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate empire that dominated the Manhattan skyline. Forbes called her a visionary. Wall Street called her a machine. With a net worth hovering around $4.2 billion, Eleanor lived in a world of bulletproof glass, private helicopters, and calculated silence. She had no husband, no children, and no vulnerabilities, at least none that showed on a balance sheet. But behind the bespoke Armani suits and the icy demeanor, Eleanor was drowning. The Vanguard Nexus 10th Anniversary Gala was supposed to be her crowning achievement. Held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, the room was packed with senators, tech moguls, and international investors. Eleanor stood on the balcony overlooking Central Park, a flute of untouched champagne in her hand, trying to steady her erratic breathing. Her chest felt like it was wrapped in barbed wire. 10 minutes ago, she had received an encrypted text from a loyal junior analyst. It contained a dossier of offshore wire transfers, forged signatures and dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands. Over $300 million had been siphoned from Vanguard's pension fund. The signatures on the transfer orders were hers, but she hadn't signed them. Her chief financial officer, Harrison Cole, her mentor, and the man who had helped her build the company from a cramped Brooklyn garage, had framed her. Worse, the text warned that Harrison had already tipped off the SEC and the FBI. They weren't coming tomorrow. They were coming tonight. In less than an hour, the feds would walk to the gala place, the billionaire prodigy in handcuffs, and parade her out for the paparazzi. Harrison would step in as acting CEO to stabilize the stock, effectively stealing her empire while she rotted in federal holding. Eleanor's vision blurred. The clinical, debilitating panic attacks she had kept secretly medicated for years roared to the surface. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the luxurious hotel felt like a tomb. She didn't think. She just ran. Slipping down the service elevator, Eleanor bypassed her private security detail and fled into the labyrinth of the New York streets. It was pouring a relentless torrential November rain. She left behind her phone, her purse, and her identity. By the time she reached the winding, shadow-draped streets of Greenwich Village, she was soaked to the bone. Her $4,000 heels were ruined, her silk dress plastered to her shivering frame, and her heart was beating so violently she thought her ribs might crack. A few blocks away, Jack Sullivan was sitting on a damp wooden bench in the alley behind the Dusty Spine, a failing independent bookstore he had inherited. Jack wasn't a businessman. 2 years ago, he was a decorated FDNY paramedic out of Engine 44. He was the guy who ran into burning buildings, the guy who kept people breathing when their worlds collapsed. But Jack couldn't save his own wife. Chloe had died in a multi-car pileup on the BQE, a crash Jack's own unit had responded to. The trauma had broken him. He handed in his badge, took over his late father's bookstore, and devoted every waking second to raising his 5-year-old son, Toby. Jack lived a life of quiet, suffocating grief. He was barely making the mortgage the bank was threatening foreclosure, and the light in his eyes had long since burned out. Tonight, Toby was asleep upstairs in their small apartment above the shop. Jack had stepped out into the rain with a cup of stale coffee, letting the icy downpour numb his constant aching memories. He didn't notice the woman until she was right in front of him. Eleanor stumbled into the alley blind with panic. She was hyperventilating, her hands clutching her chest as black spots danced in her vision. Her ankle gave out on the wet cobblestones. She didn't just fall. She collapsed her knees, buckling as her body shut down. She pitched forward, plunging directly into Jack. Jack's coffee shattered on the ground. His paramedic instincts, dormant for 2 years, snapped awake in a fraction of a second. He caught her before her head hit the brick wall, pulling her shivering, soaked frame onto his lap on the bench. Hey, look at me," Jack said, his voice a low, steady rumble over the crashing rain. Eleanor couldn't speak. She clawed at her throat, gasping for air that wouldn't enter her lungs. "I'm dying," she thought. "This is it. Harrison won, and I'm dying in an alley." "You're not dying," Jack said, reading the sheer terror in her eyes. He didn't know he was holding the CEO of Vanguard Nexus. He just saw a broken woman. He pulled her against his chest, shielding her from the rain, and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point on her neck. It was racing at a dangerous speed. He leaned down, his mouth right next to her ear. "Just breathe with me," Jack whispered. It wasn't a command. It was an anchor. A quiet, unwavering tether in the middle of her storm. "Forget tomorrow. Forget the next hour. Just give me the next second." In and out. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Hastings surrendered control. She pressed her face into the rough canvas of Jack's jacket, smelling the scent of old paper rain and cedar. She listened to the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart beneath her ear. It was the only solid thing left in her world. "That's it," Jack murmured, his large hand rubbing slow grounding circles on her trembling back. "1 second at a time. I've got you. You're safe." It took 10 minutes for the attack to break. When the oxygen finally returned to her brain, the shivering set in. Eleanor slowly pulled back, suddenly hyper-aware of the situation. She was sitting on a stranger's lap in a dark alley. She looked up into Jack's face. He had striking, tired grey eyes, a heavy stubble, and a gaze that held absolutely zero judgment. I'm sorry," Eleanor stammered, trying to stand up, but her sprained ankle screamed in agony. She winced, falling back against him. "Easy," Jack said, catching her waist. "You tore a ligament, and you're freezing. I'm Jack." "Nora," she lied automatically, using her middle name. I need to go. If they find me." Before she could finish her sentence, the sharp screech of tires echoed at the end of the alley. 2 matte black SUVs jerked to a halt at the curb. 4 men stepped out. They weren't police. They wore tailored dark suits and moved with the quiet, predatory efficiency of private corporate fixers. Harrison's men. They were doing a grid search of the surrounding blocks. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Please," she whispered to Jack, sheer terror masking her face. "Hide me." Jack didn't ask questions. He didn't demand an explanation. He took one look at the men approaching the mouth of the alley, scooped Eleanor up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the heavy steel door at the back of his shop. He keyed the lock, slipped inside, and bolted it shut just as the beam of a high-powered flashlight swept across the wooden bench where they had been sitting seconds before. Inside the dusty spine was dark, smelling faintly of vanilla and aged binding glue. Jack carried her to a battered leather sofa in the back office and gently set her down. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from a chair and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. "Keep quiet," Jack whispered, holding a finger to his lips. They sat in the dark. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside the back door. The doorknob rattled violently. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest, bracing for the door to kick open. Jack stepped between her and the door, his posture shifting from a comforting stranger to a formidable shield. He grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the corner, his knuckles turning white. For agonizing minutes the fixers lingered. Finally a voice muttered something muffled through the steel and the footsteps faded away. The SUVs drove off. The silence in the bookstore was deafening. Jack lowered the iron bar and turned on a small, warm desk lamp. The soft amber light illuminated the cramped office. "They're gone," Jack said, his voice calm. He pulled a first aid kit from a drawer and knelt at her feet. Without asking, he gently removed her ruined designer heel and began wrapping her swollen ankle with an ace bandage. "I'm guessing those weren't your friends. They're men paid to make sure I sign away my life before the authorities lock me up for a crime I didn't commit," Eleanor said softly. Stripped of her title, her money, and her power, the truth just spilled out of her. "I was betrayed." Jack tied off the bandage and looked up at her. He didn't look shocked. "Money makes monsters out of people, Nora." She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a framed photograph on the desk. It was Jack, looking years younger and smiling brightly, holding a beautiful woman with a newborn baby. The frame was dusty, as if it had been touched 1,000 times but never moved. "Your family?" Eleanor asked gently. Jack's jaw tightened. He looked at the photo, and the impenetrable sorrow returned to his eyes. "My wife, Chloe. She passed away 3 years ago. It's just me and my son, Toby, now. He's upstairs." Eleanor felt a pang in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety. "I'm so sorry, Jack. You saved me tonight, and I dragged my mess to your doorstep. I shouldn't be here." "You had a panic attack," Jack said, leaning back against the edge of the desk. "I was a paramedic for 10 years. I know what it looks like when someone's soul is trying to escape their body. You were completely broken out there." "I am broken," Eleanor admitted, a single tear cutting through the rainwater on her cheek. "Everything I built is gone. My company, my reputation. By tomorrow morning, my face will be on every news channel in the country. I have nowhere to go." Jack looked at her. He saw the expensive silk dress, the refined posture, the unmistakable aura of someone who was used to giving orders. But he also saw the terrified girl shivering under a wool blanket. He knew what it was like to have your entire world wiped out in a single Tuesday evening. Before he could respond, a soft creak echoed from the wooden stairs. A small boy with messy brown hair wearing oversized dinosaur pajamas rubbed his eyes and walked into the office. He clutched a worn-out stuffed bear. "Dad," Toby mumbled sleepily. "I heard a noise. Is it raining?" Jack's entire demeanor softened. The tough, guarded exterior melted away. He walked over, hoisted Toby into his arms, and kissed his forehead. "Yeah, buddy, just a thunderstorm. Go back to sleep." Toby peeked over his dad's shoulder and saw Eleanor on the couch. He blinked his large, innocent eyes. "Who is she? Is she a princess?" "She looks wet." Despite the nightmare she was living in, a small, genuine laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. It felt foreign in her throat. "She's a friend, Tobes," Jack said softly, looking over at Eleanor with a gaze that made her breath hitch. She just needed a safe place to hide from the storm for a little while. As Jack carried his son back upstairs, Eleanor looked down at her hands. She was Eleanor Hastings, the ruthless billionaire. She was hunted, framed, and utterly alone. Yet sitting in a bankrupt bookstore with a grieving widow and his fatherless son, she felt something she hadn't felt in a decade. She felt safe. But the peace wouldn't last. Across the city, Harrison Cole was sitting at Eleanor's mahogany desk in the Vanguard Nexus Tower. He dialed a secure number on his burner phone. "Did you find her?" Harrison asked coldly. "No, sir," the voice of Dominic, the lead fixer, replied. "She vanished in the village, but we're pulling the city's CCTV feeds now. We'll have her location by morning." "Find her," Harrison hissed, "before she realizes that the offshore accounts can still be traced back to me. If she gets to the feds first and proves she didn't sign those documents, we all go to prison. I don't care who gets in your way. Eliminate the problem." Morning broke over Manhattan in hues of cold, bruised purple. Inside the back office of the Dusty Spine, Eleanor woke up on the battered leather sofa. She was wrapped in Jack's oversized flannel shirt, her silk gala dress hanging dry over a radiator. For a fleeting second, the scent of vanilla and old paper lulled her into a false sense of security. Then reality crashed back into her chest. She walked into the main shop. Jack was behind the counter, pouring black coffee into two mismatched mugs. Above him, a small muted television mounted on the wall flashed breaking news on CNN. Breaking Vanguard Nexus. CEO Eleanor Hastings, fugitive in $300 million fraud probe. A glamorous, imposing photo of Eleanor at a Forbes summit was plastered across the screen. Jack didn't look shocked. He slid a mug across the scratched wooden counter. Cream and sugar, or do you take it black when you're on the run from the FBI, Eleanor? Eleanor stared at the mug, her hands trembling. You're not calling the police. My grandfather started this bookstore in 1968. Jack said, his voice a steady, grounding force. I know corporate sharks. I've watched them devour this neighborhood block by block. The woman on that screen is a ruthless billionaire. The woman who fell into my arms last night was terrified. I trust the woman from the alley. Eleanor exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years. Harrison Cole, my CFO, orchestrated the entire embezzlement. He funneled the Vanguard pension funds into offshore accounts at Cayman National Bank and mirrored my IP address to forge the digital authorizations. He's framing me to trigger a hostile takeover. Then we go to the police, Jack said simply. I can't, Eleanor replied, her strategic mind finally booting up. Harrison has the SEC and the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit in his pocket. If I walk into a precinct, I'll be held in federal lockup without bail, and he'll finalize the hostile takeover by Monday morning. But there is a fail-safe. Jack leaned forward. What kind of fail-safe? Eleanor pulled out a piece of scrap paper and a pen from the counter, outlining her survival plan. The hardware key. I never trusted Vanguard's cloud servers. I kept a YubiKey, an encrypted physical flash drive that contains the immutable cryptographic hashes of my actual digital signatures. The location. It's in a private safety deposit box at the First Republic Bank branch on Fifth Avenue, registered under a shell corporation named Cypress Holdings. The proof. If we cross-reference the timestamps on the YubiKey with the Cayman transfers, it proves I was physically locked out of the system when the money was stolen. It proves Harrison did it. Okay, Jack said, slipping on his heavy canvas jacket. Then we go to the bank. Before Eleanor could reply, the heavy front window of the dusty spine shattered inward. A hail of tempered glass exploded across the antique mahogany shelves. Eleanor screamed, ducking behind the counter. Jack dropped instantly, shielding her body with his own. Through the shattered window stepped Dominic Harrison's lead fixer, flanked by two massive men in tactical gear. They had tracked Eleanor via a bodega's ATM camera across the street. Dominic pulled a suppressed handgun from his jacket, his boots crunching over the glass, and ruined literature. Ms. Hastings. Dominic called out his voice, echoing in the dead quiet shop. Mr. Cole extends his regards. He needs a signature, and then unfortunately, he needs a tragic suicide. Jack's eyes met Eleanor's. The tired, grieving widow was gone. In his place was the FDNY paramedic who had survived collapsing roofs and backdrafts. He held up 3 fingers, mouthing a countdown. 3, 2, 1. Jack reached up and ripped the heavy industrial fire extinguisher off the wall bracket above the counter. He pulled the pin vaulted over the counter and aimed the nozzle directly at Dominic's face. A blinding, choking cloud of thick white chemical foam blasted into the fixers. Dominic fired blindly, the suppressed bullet tearing through a display of encyclopedias. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung the heavy steel canister like a baseball bat, catching the closest thug in the jaw with a sickening crack. "Run!" Jack roared over his shoulder. Eleanor scrambled up, her sprained ankle throbbing, and bolted for the back office. Jack grabbed her hand as they sprinted toward the basement door. He locked the deadbolt behind them, just as the fixers began bashing the wood. "Where is Toby?" Eleanor panicked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "My sister picked him up an hour ago through the alley for a play date." Jack said, his breathing heavy, as he led her down the dark, steep stairs into the basement. Thank God. The basement was a graveyard of unsold inventory and dust. Jack moved to the far wall, pushing aside a stack of heavy wooden crates to reveal a rusted iron hatch. "Old coal chute. It leads to the subway maintenance tunnels." He kicked the latch open and hoisted Eleanor up. As they crawled through the soot-stained tunnel, the sound of the basement door splintering echoed behind them. They were covered in dirt, breathless, and running out of time. But as Jack pulled her up onto the grimy platform of the abandoned City Hall subway station, Eleanor realized something profound. She had spent her entire adult life buying people's loyalty. Jack Sullivan was risking his life for her for free. The mid-morning rain provided the perfect cover as Jack and Eleanor, disguised in cheap rain ponchos they bought with Jack's emergency cash, slipped into the opulent lobby of First Republic Bank. Eleanor kept her head down her wet hair, acting as a veil. She handed the teller a black metallic card. "Access for Cypress Holdings, please." The teller, oblivious to the news, smiled warmly. "Right this way, ma'am." Inside the cold steel vault, Eleanor unlocked Box 814. She pulled out a small velvet pouch containing the UB key. She gripped it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I have the bullet," she whispered. "Now I need a gun." "I know a guy," Jack said, pulling out his battered cell phone. "My old FDNY captain's brother's Gregory Walsh. He's a special agent with the FBI's cyber division at Federal Plaza. He owes my family a favor." 45 minutes later, they were sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at the FBI field office in Lower Manhattan. Special Agent Gregory Walsh, a stern man with a graying buzz cut, plugged the UB key into a secure terminal. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the clacking of Walsh's keyboard. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hand resting on the metal table. Jack reached out and placed his rough, warm hand over hers. The simple gesture sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. She didn't pull away. Finally, Walsh leaned back in his chair. "Well, Miss Hastings, it's a slam dunk. The cryptographic logs prove your credentials were spoofed from a terminal inside Mr. Cole's private residence. We also found a secondary communication log. Harrison Cole wasn't just stealing the money. He was selling Vanguard's proprietary tenant data to a rival firm in Beijing." Eleanor closed her eyes. The nightmare was over. "We're issuing the arrest warrants now," Walsh said, standing up. "We'll have SWAT at the Vanguard Tower in 10 minutes. 2 hours later, Harrison Cole stood in Eleanor's magnificent corner office, swirling a glass of scotch. He was admiring the Manhattan skyline, already mentally measuring the space for his own furniture. The news of Eleanor's disappearance was dominating the airwaves. He had won. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite suddenly shattered the silence. Harrison turned a smug smile plastered on his face, expecting his fixers. Instead, a dozen heavily armed FBI tactical agents swarmed the room, their rifles raised. Harrison Cole. Agent Walsh barked, stepping through the formation. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and attempted murder. Keep your hands where I can see them." Harrison's Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the Italian marble floor. His face drained of all color. From behind the wall of federal agents stepped Eleanor Hastings. She was still wearing Jack's oversized flannel, her hair damp, her face devoid of makeup. She had never looked more powerful. "You missed a spot on the balance sheet, Harrison," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with absolute terrifying calm. "You forgot to account for me." As they slapped the cuffs on her former mentor and dragged him out, Eleanor didn't feel the triumphant high she expected. She just felt exhausted. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the empire she had built, realizing it was nothing more than a glass cage. 6 months later, the bell above the door of the Dusty Spine chimed merrily. The shop looked entirely different. The shattered window was replaced, the shelves were fully stocked, and the scent of vanilla and fresh coffee filled the warm air. The bank foreclosure notices were gone. Eleanor walked in, shaking the December snow from her coat. She wasn't wearing an Armani suit. She wore a comfortable knit sweater and jeans. After her exoneration, Eleanor had returned to Vanguard Nexus just long enough to clean house. She fired the corrupt board members, restructured the pension fund, and then did the unthinkable. She stepped down as CEO. She retained her majority shares, but handed the daily operations to a trusted proxy. She had spent a decade building a fortune. She decided it was time to build a life. Her first act as a free woman was to anonymously buy the buildings that housed the Dusty Spine, tearing up Jack's lease and signing the deed over to him and Toby. Jack emerged from the back office, hoisting a laughing Toby onto his shoulders. When Jack saw Eleanor, his face broke into a smile that reached all the way to his tired grey eyes that weren't so tired anymore. "Look, Dad, Nora's here," Toby cheered. Jack walked over, letting Toby slide down to run to the children's section. He stood in front of Eleanor, the space between them humming with a quiet, profound magnetism. "You're late for your shift, Hastings," Jack teased, his voice a low rumble. Traffic on the FDR. Eleanor smiled, stepping closer. She reached up, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "Besides, the owner of this place is notoriously lenient." "Only with you," Jack whispered. He didn't hesitate this time. Jack leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted like coffee snow and second chances. It was a kiss that held the weight of a shattered billionaire and a broken paramedic, two lost souls who had collided in the darkest of storms and built an anchor out of each other. Eleanor Hastings had lost her empire in a single night, but standing in the warm glow of the little bookstore, wrapped in the arms of the man who had caught her when she fell, she knew she had finally found something priceless. Did Eleanor and Jack's incredible journey of resilience, trust, and finding love in the darkest storms inspire you? Sometimes the most powerful empires are the families we choose to build. If this thrilling story of taking back control touched your heart, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of romance, survival, and ultimate comebacks. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Eleanor's shoes?